two, 1, 2, 3, go.
Welcome to A New Tone. This is our debut episode. I'm Zach Morgenstern.
And I'm Fraser Allen Best.
So this reunion is a long time coming. Fraser and I hosted a radio show at the University of Toronto back in 2016. And now in 2023, we have decided to regroup. So our old show was called Leading Tone. And the concept was that we came up with a current events topic every week and connected it to songs. It was a concept I enjoyed, but it also had some structural problems. One was that being based in Canada, we were actually required by law to have 1/3 of our songs be Canadian content. I mean, because we were doing the radio, we were regulated by public broadcasting law. So this often meant, you'd have a concept, but then you'd have to desperately come up with a politically leaning Canadian singer and see, did they write something about this? So I learned to fall in love with Buffy St. Marie in that time, and otherwise you'd have to desperately see, did Gordon Lightfoot maybe force himself to be a little political? Does Neil Young have something on this? I'm sure you remember the Agony Fraser.
We ended up sometimes you discover that there's good artists that you should be paying more attention to, but a lot of the times, there's the tendency to be like, to go the other way, to be like, oh, let's try to find an artist I already like. Because it would be kind of in the 11th hour if you're trying to fit in enough Canadian content that I already like, who has something vaguely political. Yeah, it's tricky.
The other thing I'm trying to sort of grow beyond with this is I think both our own instincts at the time, and we were also kind of egged on by our mentors to constantly be at loggerheads politically. Because we do have different politics, but I don't think the point of political discussion should be, scoring points over another person. Ideally, you want to agree as much as possible so you're, actually building a constructive idea to put out in the world.
Right. I think there's combative stuff is also easy to make. Because we're doing them once a week, and I think on that timeline, it's easy to, if there's a good battle to have, that can kind of easily come together in the course of a week. And it was also a time that was fairly politically tumultuous. It wasn't quite Trump season yet. That was kind of, I guess it was leading up to Trump joining the news. But even when we weren't talking about Trump, in general, the tone of that period was very conflictual. And I think that came out in our show style at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that said, the idea you pitched to me for our first episode here is kind of in the spirit of our old program, in that we're talking about a political song. And that political song specifically is
Men North of Richmond.
Yep, so we're about a month behind on the news, perhaps more when this gets out there. Men North of Richmond is a song written by a singer-songwriter whose stage name is Oliver Anthony. He plays his music in a rural setting. He has a thick, bright red beard. He plays a style of guitar called a dobro, and it's his only instrument, and he wails beautifully. So who knows how songs get big, but Men North of Richmond got big despite the seemingly rustic indie appearance of its singer. It made it to the top of the Billboard 100 chart. And to be honest, that was enough to kind of intrigue me. So part of my background is that I'm a singer-songwriter, aspiring singer-songwriter myself. And I often find myself looking at the lore of old rock and roll, how Elvis Presley walked into Sun Recording Studios just to do a demo record for his mother, and this producer heard him, and the producer's like, yeah, kid, I can make you a star. It was simple as that. Or another of my heroes, Neil Diamond, he got these sort of minimum wage jobs writing songs at the Brill Building that would then be sold to real pop acts, and eventually he wrote enough of these songs that someone agreed to record him, and the rest is history. It feels like nowadays there's not these sort of institutions you can just go to and audition for and be taken really seriously. You have to really luck out and be created by some talent factory. And I know I'm looking at the past through rose-colored glasses, but I don't know, it certainly seems like it's a lot harder to access the musical world than in the quote-unquote good on days. So just before we get into any politics, one thing I find really compelling about just watching the music video, if you can even call it that, for Richmond North of Richmond. This isn't some guy who was overproduced by the Disney Corporation and brought out into the world already with 1 million Instagram followers. It seems like he, quote unquote, just made it with his talent. So that sort of musical aesthetic piece aside, let's talk some politics. The politics of Richmond North of Richmond are ambiguous. When one hears a rant against the rich, one thinks of the left. And the left is certainly the side of the political aisle most associated with folk music, with protest songs. But there's also a more conservative side to Oliver Anthony's composition. It complains about taxes, for one, and it also complains about welfare, seemingly belittling and even fat-shaming welfare recipients. You would think that a song that is politically ambiguous like that would be discussed for what it is, politically ambiguous or heterodox. But that was not really how our culture reacted. Instead, the political right rushed to embrace the song, with it even getting played and awkwardly made a subject of discussion at the Republican Party's presidential debate. And meanwhile, figures in the liberal or even leftist media rushed to denounce the song. I find the article on NPR is a particularly exemplary piece of how hostile people on the sort of cultural soft left were to it. Not just pointing out the things I did about welfare and taxes, but even saying the song promotes conspiracy theories. Now, I know where this impulse comes from to not just accept things to ambiguous, to say, no, it's really serving this side. I mean, there's a song that comes out of the labor tradition that goes, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Sometimes you have to pick a side to get things done. You have to know where things stand, not get lost in the weeds. But while this kind of logic is important for decisive moments that truly offer binary choices, I really think it's become too much of a norm. In this age of social media, people are a bit too desperate to say X is either on this good side or on this bad side. And frankly, to be a functioning society, we can't work that way because we need to be able to communicate. We need to have good comprehension skills. We can't just say something falls into either box A or box B. If it falls into box C or box A.5, we have to be able to articulate that and understand that. I also think it fosters this kind of paranoid mindset where the left is constantly like, hey, this thing that's a little bit left and a little bit right, well, all that means is it's secretly fascist. I mean, obviously there are fascists in the world. Obviously there are scary, terrible things in the world. But I don't think it's either an accurate or a healthy mindset to act like there's a hidden fascist hidden in every other person. So what do I make of Richmond North of Richmond personally? I think it's a decent song, even as I don't love its politics. So I actually posted my own reaction to it on my personal YouTube channel closer to the time it came out. I repeated I said many of the same thoughts I'm telling you now. And I also made this comparison to a song I really like, which is the song Rebels by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So for those who don't know it, Rebels is a song about a destitute man, and it's a song that could certainly rub progressive people the wrong way, because the singer of the song seems to identify with the Southern Confederacy. He sings in the last verse, even before our fathers' fathers, they called us all rebels. They burned our cornfields and left our cities level. I can still see the eyes of those blue-bellied devils, referring to the North. Now, what I said in my video is that Rebels is meant to be a character study. Tom Petty, whose own politics, insofar as he had them, seemed to have been progressive, went out of his way to say, do not interpret this as a pro-Confederate song. I'm writing about a certain type of person who would use pro-Confederate language to express their frustration. And honestly, this is a challenge I think we as songwriters face. People sort of by default assume our works are confessional in a way people wouldn't assume of other artists. I don't assume people pick up Catcher in the Rye and think Holden Caulfield and J.D. Salinger are the same person. So this was the spin I tried to put in my analysis of Richmond North of Richmond. I looked at the verse where he seems to really go on a rant about welfare recipients, And what stood out to me as a writer of lyrics is that it sort of stops feeling like a song and starts to feel like a rant. So it goes, I wish politicians would look out for minors and not just minors on an island somewhere. Lord, we got folks in the street, ain't got nothing to eat. And the obese, milk and welfare. And here's the part that kind of stands out to me. Well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Young men are putting themselves 6 feet in the ground because all this darn country does is keep on kicking them down. So, yeah, to me, this does not sound like the continuation of a poetic verse. It sounds like someone getting distracted and going off on a tangent. The character singing the song might be trying to make a general statement about his lot in life, but then suddenly he remembers his obese neighbor John, who really pisses him off, and he goes, F that guy, John, darn him and his fudge rounds, I hate John, John is the cause of all our problems. Very few of us are truly lucid as people. We might begin to make valid statements about injustice, and then our personal biases seep in and make our analysis less relevant. Sometimes it also feels easier to rant about people in our lives who we perceive as problematic rather than going after the people in high places who frankly feel untouchable. So that was kind of my spin initially on Men North of Richmond, that maybe it can be best enjoyed if we don't view the song as simply a statement of values, but rather a statement of perspective. This is what one kind of disenfranchised working class person might feel. Now, what's kind of risky and interesting about putting yourself out on a platform like YouTube is you're going to get reactions. I got comments from Oliver Anthony's fans that were not always the kindest. They were quite condescending, and it was hard to tell exactly what was going on. I think some of it is people don't respond to what they're actually hearing. They respond to what they think they're hearing. So they heard me at some point in the video say something's critical of the song, so they posted their sort of generic, oh, F you, you silly liberal kind of comments. But I will admit, after reflecting, that I did make a bit of a mistake in just saying that the lines about welfare in the song represented a flawed worldview. I kind of gave Oliver Anthony the benefit of the doubt in saying, oh, he didn't really mean this part, he's being a character. That was putting my political perspective on it. And I think what's so interesting about Oliver Anthony, why he says he doesn't identify as left or right, is he truly has a political ideology, which is one we don't talk about a lot in contemporary, big news media politics, which I would call communitarianism. Generally, if you hear someone say they're not left, they're not right, like I think of the dictator of Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, who his sort of BS line was, I'm not left, I'm not right, I'm not even center, I'm just me and I'm amazing. But what Oliver Anthony is saying is he doesn't identify with the right, these people who believe hierarchies are fair, that competition and the free market are good, but he doesn't agree with the left that government is the solution. His idea is basically things have to happen locally, and local people can behave in solidarity and take care of each other, but when you have a big state and bureaucracy, he doesn't believe that works.
Almost a libertarian. Interesting, libertarian adjacent, perhaps.
Yeah, I call it libertarian adjacent. Now, to be clear, this is not my worldview, and a big part of that is, I am a big city guy. I'm someone who enjoys living in a complex society, and I don't think I would like to take the sort of back to the earth path that Oliver Anthony has seemingly taken. But I guess my point is it is important to take people for what they are actually saying, not characterize them as saying something that they are not. So Men North of Richmond, one interpretation is that it's just sort of an expression of some kind of working class angst, and it's not really political. Another interpretation is it's an expression of a communitarian political worldview. Those are basically my thoughts on this. I know that was a lot. Fraser, what are your thoughts on the song and what I had to say?
Oh, we're going to disagree on a lot of things, and I have a kind of exorcism I want to subject you to in a moment on the idea of what exactly it is getting at politically. But I guess it's important to talk about, you began by talking a bit about the context of the show we were doing before and kind of where things went from there. And I think there's actually an interesting story that I can tell about what I did following Leading Tone. And a point that you made about Canadian content on Leading Tone is that it was often hard to find, with the requirement that we have Canadian content, it was sometimes hard to, there was a struggle to include enough Canadian content in the limited format of our show. And I think part of the reason that is because, and you might disagree with this, but Canadian musicians are in general a little less political. Your taste in music and my taste in music includes a lot of 1960s, 70s, and perhaps early 80s singer-songwriters.
Right.
And I would say that Canadian singer-songwriters are not, first of all, they're not involved in the Vietnam War era of music very much.
Right.
And there's just not as, like, the same type of political activist culture in Canada in music.
Yeah.
There are exceptions that I don't want to ignore, but I would say in general.
Sure, yeah, just to quickly jump in, and I don't know if this is true, but I heard it was actually because they needed to cross the border to tour. They didn't want to get on blacklists. Yeah. I heard this theory that Gordon Lightfoot's Summer Side of Life was a very veiled anti-Vietnam War song, but you'd really have to dig into the weeds in that song for that to be the case. But no, I think you're right. Of the big ones I know, Buffy St. Marie, who was on a blacklist, is the one exception I can think of.
Yeah, well, I think part of the reason is because Canada doesn't have quite as, like, we have a reasonably homogenous political culture. There's not, though there is still a left-right divide, I would say, and this is going to get at the rest of the discussion we'll have,
sure,
that there's not significant philosophical differences among Canadians in the same way there is among Americans. And the interesting thing that happened to me after our last show is kind of two things that kind of segue well into Men North of Richmond, which is that I went to a school that is not in the South, but it's definitely in, like, the non-liberal America. Like, it's not in the deep South in the sense that it's not like in Alabama, but I went to Arizona State University.
Yeah, so geographical South, not quite cultural South.
No, but interestingly, like, it is still a predominantly Republican state that has, although it's a little closer to the border of Republican and Democrat. It's a state that probably have a lot of people who are now new fans of Oliver. His name is neither Oliver nor, like, it's
Anthony is his middle name. I think it's Chris Anthony Lumsford. And just a quick aside, one weird dynamic is I noticed the fans who are, like, angry at me in my YouTube comments, they kept calling him Chris and seemed to be annoyed I was using his stage name. I don't know what the deal is there.
Yeah, that's weird. Yeah, I think it's that Oliver is a family name that he's using. Yeah. Regardless, it's a state that would probably have a lot of sympathy towards the points that Anthony Oliver was making. And also a state that I think, in general, where I was exposed to at least what I see as a political philosophy that undergirds the other half of America, and I'll get to that in a second. But the interesting thing that happened to me, right after that, rather not prior to that, is after this degree that I did in Arizona, I lived in Washington, which is in fact the place just north of Richmond that they're talking about, and it definitely was a considerably different city. At the time, it actually felt a lot like coming back to Toronto because, for a lot of reasons, Washington is actually fairly, A, it's very liberal, and B, it has the feeling of being in somewhere like Toronto because it's, a relatively infrastructurally nice downtown, has a lot of kind of a walking type downtown culture that leads to this kind of, like, a lot of people with man buns who love lattes. And so I think there's an interesting two experiences that I have that probably fueled some of my perspective on this particular song, where I would say that I think there's a tendency for people in Toronto, and I would say liberals in the US, to believe that when talking particularly about class, I think the conception people would have is that the more compassion-driven side, the people for whom the sentiment of compassion is more fueling their politics, is the left wing, particularly on labor issues. Whereas I am here to say that I don't think the right wing, particularly the modern right, the post-Trump or at least peri-Trump right, because it actually predated Trump a little bit, this kind of new labor movement, I think they would say that they are fueled primarily by questions of compassion. The reason this is important is because I think on the issue of the controversial lyric about, obese people growing fat and dying on welfare, I think that is an issue where I see the Liberal response being, this is a heartless thing to say about people on welfare, missing the fact that I think Oliver Anthony is being quite, I think he reflects a mindset that actually is a compassion-driven one. I think there's this old view of that if you're making a right-wing critique of the welfare state, that we want to fit it into the slot of kind of Reagan talking about welfare queens, that these are people who are getting fat and sassy and living the high life on the public dole. Whereas I think Oliver Anthony is making a different claim that I hear more now, which is that it's actually an injustice is being perpetrated against people by getting them in economic situations where they're reliant on constant money that fuels a downward spiral. And I think this is triggered kind of a view that's been was kind of emerged around the time of Trump, but was further concretized by the opioid epidemic, where you had people who were primarily poor and on some sort of government subsidy who were then dying of overdoses and living terrible, unhealthy lives. And also, and I think this is also played out in this song, a post-COVID pandemic critique, which is that the government is now taking a very strong role in people's lives. Particularly, there was a lot of payouts that happened during COVID, CERB being the predominant one, that led people to now view the government as far more paternal and perhaps a cruel paternal figure in people's lives.
Right. And the thing is, a left perspective doesn't have to be that different than that. I guess the left framing of that would be, if you're only giving enough welfare money for people to afford the cheapest, least healthy food, or, as is often the case for people in this province where, disability welfare is not in line with the cost of living, and non-disability welfare is even lower, people choosing between rent and food, for instance. The argument would be, well, if you're giving people this little help, you're just giving them another way to screw themselves, right? They can only buy this cheap food and they get sick on it. Perhaps they get addicted to it, if that's the right word. But then we would say, well, maybe the solution is having a wider array of social programs or sort of more radical government intervention in various ways. And I think what people find strange and seemingly cruel, at least on their first listen to Men North of Richmond, is, I guess, the specifics of his lyrics, the imagery of milking welfare. And I mean, I guess that doesn't necessarily have to be an insult. You could say it's that paternal thing you're saying, milking is like you're in sort of like this infantilized state, and perhaps he's saying the government is infantilizing you. But it just feels like, yes, he might be making this reasonable or mostly reasonable point, but I imagine a sort of more explicitly left-wing songwriter would couch that a bit more and say, the answer is not no welfare, it's better welfare, or programs that would not simply be called welfare, like a national jobs guarantee or funding for,
Maybe, but I think he means to make this point because this comes about in the political climate where there's a discussion about like how a lot of, you could argue that this is what fueled the Trump era, which is that like a ton of the American labor force is just like out of a job. He talks about miners in that, but there's also like, there's a million blue collar jobs that are vastly on the decline because of automation and jobs going overseas. And I think in light of that, there's this question of like, what do we do with the fact there's a ton of blue collar workers? And there's really two like broad directions that I think this song attempts to, like two policy, like this song I see as saying, we have a problem that if you're like a blue collar laborer in the US, you can either, work your fingers to the bone and barely scrape by, and that's a hellish life. Or, and then the song appropriately goes to the other end of the scale and goes, or your other option is that you can, and I think this is something that occasionally is offered as a solution to the kind of lack of blue collar jobs in America, you can live on like social support but that'll also lead to its own hellish spiral to terrible outcomes, which is somewhat true. Like if you look at people who are like laid off from in like mining communities, they go to shit. They have crazy high obesity, they have crazy high drug use, they have crazy short lives. So I think what this song is intentionally saying, I think it would be wrong for it to pull up its punches on this side, is saying we have a labor problem, and that means that you either have to work for very scarce wages, or the other alternative isn't even good. Like I think he's actually presenting a hellish dichotomy,
Right.
and that if he only said, well, here's the thing, we should be better paid, but don't worry, welfare is a great solution, he would be failing to communicate what I think is the core problem that I think has not been answered adequately by either the left or the right, which is like, what do you do with the fact there's a bunch of people who can only do manual labor jobs, and there's like very few of them now, and rapidly there's fewer and fewer.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess just to repeat myself and kind of end this point, I don't know if you had any further questions. Any critique of a social program is critiquing a social program at the level it's currently funded. And you can see that in all kinds of issues, whether it's critiques of bed space in universal healthcare systems, whether it's the degradation of government buildings. The critique is of the program as it's currently funded. And sure, someone like you, a libertarian especially, could make a sort of abstract critique of a better funded version of that program. You might say there's something inherently wrong with government spending a lot more, and of course I would disagree with you.
Why?
Oh, well, I think that's going on a tangent.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess what I'm getting at here is that...
Is it because you don't think that if people are entirely on welfare, that will necessarily lead to the bad sort of health outcomes?
No, well, I assume the people who quote unquote only eat fudge rounds do so because their welfare check isn't great. Whereas if you give them, a slightly better welfare check and they're able to eat healthy food and they're sort of motivated to go to school and get training to find more interesting jobs, then they might actually integrate into society rather than falling into this destructive sense of despair.
But then you agree with him, because all he's saying is that it's clearly a miscalibrated welfare system. Because I think I've heard him in another interview say he's not against social assistance.
Right. And I think the other interesting thing with his situation, he seemed to be surprised that people were, quote unquote, politicizing his song, and people went back at him and say, well, wait a minute, you wrote a political song. But you have to consider, this is a guy who was not at all famous, who suddenly became famous, and he's just articulating some feelings he had in song form. So yeah, it's maybe not a fully fleshed out version of his political vision or anyone's political vision. And I think that's the messiness of criticizing a piece of art, because sure, I could take issue with him not putting in certain caveats or not saying anything, not qualifying exactly what his position is on welfare, but in art you don't have to say everything. You're expressing a human voice in a certain moment in time.
But do you agree that there can be a problem with miscalibrated or miscreated?
Yes, if you throw
with
in
what
the
he's
caveat
describing.
Miscalibrated, yes. I do think we have agreement there.
There's but it doesn't seem as if anything that you believe would be necessarily opposed to any of his direct sentiments. No. Only, I guess it depends on what is being written into the blanks of what he's saying.
Exactly.
Cool. Another point that I think this brings up is Rainn Wilson, the guy who played Dwight Schrute, also had a prominent comment on this song. Rainn Wilson says that we should be talking about CEOs who are paid too much rather than talking about welfare queens, which is, I think, how he conceptualizes it, though he might not have said it that way. I think that view, which I think reflects how a lot of people on the left are seeing it, because I think we can agree that while the left and the right are neither fully aligned with it, neither the left or right are fully aligned with the lyrics of the song, the right has generally been more welcome to this artist, whereas the left has been the one to critique it. Even though neither of them, and that partially has to do with the fact that I think there is the left is very into purity. If you don't think everything they think, you think none of the things they think, you're a complete enemy. Whereas the right's a little less pure. They're a little less key on everyone agreeing with everything all the time. Do you agree with that notion?
Yeah, I'm sure there are nuances, but broadly that seems to be the pattern.
Okay, cool. That's one of the first things you've actually said that you agree with or disagree with. You've been very vague, and I'm going to try to nail you down on some ideas now, which is, I think what Rainn Wilson wants to say there a little bit is that you should be talking about critiquing your corporate overlords, as opposed to just Richmond North of Richmond, which is really just pointing to DC, as kind of the people who are destroying America, not welfare queens. But I think there's a failure again, much like I said earlier, there was a failure to misunderstand that people on the right can have compassionate concerns about those on welfare, not just the feeling that the welfare system is being sucked dry and their tax dollars are being exploited. Similarly, I think that the left sometimes does not understand that half of the country draws a very crisp line between government behavior and corporate behavior, where they're kind of more favorable to corporate behavior because even though it may be ethically questionable at times, it's entirely voluntary, which is the libertarian underpinning that people often are not able to see. That he's not. I think the reason he's not objecting to corporations and rather is targeting Washington is for the same reason that a lot of people in the South care about, are more critical of government than they are about corporations, because corporations are voluntary. You can choose to engage in them or not. And there's a lot of things in this song, and I don't have the lyrics off the top of my head, but that are about individuals having their own freedom and their ability to say no. Like, for example, there's a whole thing about governments wanting to control you. They want to know what you do, or they want to know what you think, which is, I think, a feeling people don't have about corporations in the same way.
So yeah, I would disagree, because you've been talking a lot about the new right, but one of the huge patterns of them is they actually emphatically reject the whole Mitt Romney corporations or people framing. Increasingly, they do have critiques of corporations. I often think those critiques don't make very sense, or not make much sense, aren't very interesting. It's often this very superficial, corporations are woke. But no, I wouldn't assume that on sort of libertarian principles he's less harsh on corporations. I think, again, it might just be it's a song with limited, often vague lyrics. It could be the rich men north of Richmond don't just include politicians, but also the corporate donor class that very well could be in Oliver Anthony's mind. And the other possible thing is, just as I said earlier, it's easier to criticize your fudge route eating friend John than it is to criticize the powerful. I think
I don't think he's criticizing the fudge round eating.
Yeah, okay, that aside. But yeah, it's easier to criticize politicians than it is to criticize businessmen, kind of for the reason you stated, but kind of in reverse, as in then we feel some connection to politicians. We vote for them. We can complain when they're getting too big. Whereas we feel like because they have this freedom to act in a market economy, we have no power over the corporations. They're untouchable. So I think there might be an instinct among certain people who don't have an actively left-wing ideology to go after the government because it just feels like that's what's in reach to them.
Perhaps true. I think he would say that, I'm now just kind of voicing not what he would say, but rather just what I think this viewpoint sometimes entails, which is that corporations are conspiring with governments. Yeah, that there's that probably if, it's similar to what he's saying about welfare, which is that it's not blaming the person on welfare for taking advantage of government opportunities that are given to them, government support. It's blaming the government for creating those incentives, that government support that leads people to be dependent. Similarly, I think people who are, perhaps I shouldn't say I'm speaking for Oliver Anthony, but there is a view like that, but for corporations, where it's, we're not critical of corporations, we're rather critical of the governments that facilitate them. This came out strongly in, as I mentioned, I've rewatched some of the debates from Trump's first election.
I'm wondering if I'm guessing where you're going with this.
Sure, take me on a ride.
Okay, so Trump had this great line where he went
Yes.
after all the people on stage saying, I've given money to all of you, I've bought out all of you, and somehow that makes them all look corrupt, but it doesn't make him look corrupt to his fans, it makes him look cool.
Well, yes, there's that line, and there's also the line in which he says, Trump has not paid enough taxes, and he goes, I did it all legally, that makes me smart.
Right.
Which is this view that it's like, well, actually the people facilitating this is government. And that you're just being, similar to how a person on welfare, the problem is they're just being rational by relying, like they're being economically rational in accepting government pay. Like there's, I think we talked about this off mic, but like there's a situation you can be in, and this was talked a lot, Bill Clinton talked a lot about this when he was in office, which is that like, there are situations you can be in when on welfare where you're actually disincentivized from getting a job and making any of your own money because you will lose your welfare entitlements by having employment such that you could actually have less money coming in rather than more. You're in other words, the government is disincentivizing you from acting better. If you just follow the rules of the government that it's set out for you in an economically rational way, you're behaving in a way that we don't respect. And that's sometimes true of people on welfare where they won't want to engage in the economy because they're actually disincentivized. But it's also true, I think, there's definitely a view, this is also true of corporations. Mm-hmm. That in many cases we've created corporate incentives that have like facilitated bad corporate behavior. And that if you want to have better corporate behavior, government shouldn't be so, we should acknowledge that a lot of the corrupt behavior is actually facilitated by governments, not stomped out by governments. People usually see governments as the only thing that can keep corporations in check, and the only thing that can keep people who are the members of the underclass from starving. Whereas I think in many cases it actually leads people who leads CEOs to behave badly, and it leads people on. Who are members of the underclass or the disaffected former labor economy to death. And I think people don't often see that as part of one continuum, but in either case, I think there's a good argument to be made that government is both responsible for corporate, quote unquote, greed, and also responsible for some of the plight of the disaffected labor class.
Right, and now I think the explanation for that, why policies so often feel so messy and contradictory, is that there's not like a strong moral vision behind them. Often it's politicians pandering to different interests. So on the one hand, they might try and put some genuinely altruistic things in the law because they're trying to appeal to voters. They're also trying to appeal to the donor class. And so you get this mix of ideologies and goals and a little bit of good here with a weird caveat there. And yeah, then you could end up with these bizarre asymmetries that don't seem to produce a better society. But just, again, the only solution doesn't have to be less government. There could also be a sort of more inspired government, a different kind of government, to invoke the Marxist perspective, a government of the workers kind of vision where it would just look very different.
Yeah, but I think that's often what is the cover for just more misbehavior that ends up accumulating wealth in the hands of fewer people. Like I think there's this view, well, we could do this perfectly. I mean, this kind of gets to a very fundamental disagreement that you and I have.
Yes.
But like that one day we'll be able to do government perfectly. That we will have, we'll be able to actually eliminate poverty and even out unfair outcomes for, where they won't have crazy, rich and powerful people.
To end this thread, I think one day maybe we should do like a Zizek discussion on this show. I remember he really confused Jordan Peterson in his debate because he was there as the Marxist, yet it seemed like half the time he was trashing socialism and Marxism. And I think my understanding of him is he's someone who just tries to acknowledge all the problems in the world, and he'll say, even after I name all these problems, I just still think socialism in theory is better than capitalism in theory. And since life is full of darkness and problems, all we can do is just keep pursuing the best possible ideal. And even if it keeps failing, we just keep asking, what's the better solution, and for him and for me, it's a socialist path.
Okay, let me cap off that idea with what I think is something we can actually firmly agree on.
Sure.
I think one problem of how this song has been received, actually I'm going to outline two. The first one is it's been received, I think, as a more, and I understand why he says this is not a political song, because I think it's been received as more of a explicitly political song, and I think there's something very funny to be said about the fact that like people are like, this is fat shaming, which is like, as I've mentioned to you again off mic, is part of the reason I think Donald Trump will almost certainly be elected again, is that like,
Gulp.
yeah, I know, it's not good. I'm not happy about that either.
Yeah.
But like, which is that like occasionally there can be working class people who express their like disenchantment, and the thing that we'll pick out is some issue that really only like urban elites care about, word use. But more importantly, and I think more to your point, I think this song has also been, this song, when you listen to it, tonally is like a dirge. It's like a sad, first of all, the vocals are from the first word enough to make a grown man cry. They're like delivered so soulfully and sadly, and they're in like the tradition of American blues, and they have, and there's very simple instrumentation, just kind of one instrument. It's really just a guy on an instrument in his backyard, surrounded by his own dogs, looking fairly rough. And I think as a lamentation, it's a great song. And I think occasionally people have sought to find, to interrogate the lyrics with kind of what positive prescriptions is it making? When I think the song is mostly, and I think this is true of the interviews that I saw of him as well, is mostly just a like lamenting the current state of affairs. There's kind of like well, then what do you prescribe, Oliver Anthony? Mm-hmm. Are you making left-wing or right-wing prescriptions? When I actually don't think that he's interested in either one of those. And on our dichotomy, I think there's an interesting analogy to be drawn. I actually agree very much with Marx's critique of capitalism. His negative claims, I think, are quite astute, that there's significant problems with just capitalism as it can manifest. And I think you also agree that there are in some of the critiques that a libertarian would make of like central systems.
Sure.
And I think, and so all of the juice of our disagreement, both on the previous show and I think now, is in, okay, knowing that neither of these systems work perfectly well, like what positive prescriptions are like tolerable, which I think is like, obviously it's a conversation that has to happen in order for politics to work, but I think is not every person's concern, and specifically doesn't seem to be Oliver Anthony's primary motive for this song. No. And I think a lot of the reason that it hasn't been accepted by everyone is because we've got into a battle about positive claims rather than really looking at the tradition of blues and noticing that it's actually not a heavily political, it's not a movement that makes a ton of political prescriptions. And that's kind of the I think, how I end up leaving this song.
Right.
What an episode we've drilled into.
Yes. Shall I end our episode with a quotation?
Please.
Yep. So to reference those remarks Zizek was making, in short, no, I'm not going to do the accent. In short, the true courage is to admit that the light at the end of the tunnel is most likely the headlight of another train approaching us from the opposite direction.
Very fitting.
Yes.
I like it. I'm upset you didn't do the accent, but I'll let it slide.
Yeah, I think the problem is just Slovenian is too specific, and I say his accent in my head and it doesn't come out.
Your wife is Romanian. That's very close by.
Yes, well, I'm not sure she'd agree with you on that one, but I will work on my Slovenian accent, and we look forward to giving you more episodes in the future. I'm Zach.
Well, I doubt your party's gonna save the